I just love this part of the river here, of the Mclaughlin River. And I want you to come down here in the thing. You can get a shot down here. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about this beautiful gum tree here that's growing beside the river. You can see those big roots driving down there, deep into the water. That's what makes these gum trees grow. I mean, they're feeding on this river that's flowing past, which is a great resource. And for me, it's a bit of a picture about our own Australian story. What makes a great tree grow? It needs roots, it needs water. And I want to tell you a story today about a part of Australia that's become pretty well known, the Labor Party. Now, a lot of people don't know that the Labor Party, which began back in the 1890s, had roots which go right back into the Christian world, and that the men who began the Labor Party here in Australia, many of them were evangelical Christians. One of them I want to tell you a story about is a guy called William Spence. He grew up in the mid-1800s in Victoria on the goldfields. He even witnessed the Eureka Stockade Rebellion, and he reckoned that those mining days shaped him, gave him a sort of a radical view of life, if you like, the needs of the working men. And that's what made him sort of staunch for getting in alongside the working men and doing something for them. Now, it just so happened he had a very strong Presbyterian upbringing, and he himself remained a Presbyterian elder all his life, Sunday school teacher. He preached in Methodist churches wherever he got a chance. And he said, as he began to work amongst the men and call them into unions, or like particularly first of all the miners, then the shearers union around 1890, he became one of their most effective organisers and probably one of the most powerful men in Australia at the time, because he was able to organise thousands of men across South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, the itinerant workers who were moving up and down the country through the shearing sheds into unions, and alongside them the miners, and eventually he sort of influenced the maritime workers as well. And what was in his heart was he saw that he wanted to make unionism an expression of the teachings of Jesus. He says that in some of his writings. I wanted to show the working men that Jesus Christ cared about them, basically. He said it's all very well to have sort of preaching on Sunday about, you know, caring for your fellow man from Sunday to Sunday, but what happens in between? Where's the church then? And he felt that the unions and the churches could sort of work side by side, that the unions could be on the coalface, if you like, or in the mines alongside the men, or in the shearing sheds working with them and taking particular note of their needs. Now, I lived in Bourke for nearly 40 years, on and off, and I know that in the 1890s, the political upheaval in Bourke in the 1890s, Spence was actually there signing up men for the unions. One of the men who came to Bourke not long after Spence was there was a fellow called Henry Lawson, a young poet, who made his mark, of course, in writing up the mateship ethic into Australia's history. And a lot of that came from his time in Bourke. And I think that Spence's commitment to Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, which he said should be expressed in the unions, affected Henry Lawson even though he wouldn't have necessarily called himself a Christian. But one of his heroes was a fellow called, he called him the Christ of the outer outback, Peter Mclaughlin. He features him in 3 or 4 stories and a poem, and he talks about him being the rough link betwixt the bushman and God. He said this bloke went into the sheds, he worked with the men, he walked on the track with the men, he tried to get them home to their families past the grog shanties. And he said that's the kind of Christ that I respect. And that's not unlike Spence. He wanted the working men to see that Jesus was a workman himself. He'd been a carpenter, and then had his sleeves rolled up, and he liked them, that he was interested in them, and it wasn't just about going to church, but he was interested in their needs, their families, the struggles that they were facing. One of the struggles they were facing, of course, was alcohol, and a lot of the men spent their cheque before they even got home. And Lawson himself struggled with alcoholism. Spence was a teetotaler and a member of what was called the Temperance Union, which was saying, let's put grog aside, it's doing too much damage. And well, that message is still true today. It's our biggest affliction here in Australia. So it's sort of characteristic to say, well, the unions began because of Marxism, but that's not true. It was a Christian root system. These big roots here that made this tree grow. Same with the Labor Party. In fact, they named back in 2006, I think, when they opened the Labor Party headquarters down in Melbourne, they named it for W.G. Spence. This Christian man who said, I want to show the working man that Jesus Christ cares about them. Now that's a chapter that's often forgotten. One last thing, sadly I think, as time passed, and even though a lot of the early union or Labor leaders were actually Christians, some of the early premiers here in New South Wales, for example, in South Australia, were Christians and Sunday school teachers and preachers. I think during the 1930s there was a sort of a separation. The Marxists moved in, had much more influence in the Labor Party. The Christians backed off, sadly, and sort of left the field a bit clear. And one historian said, you know, the church missed an opportunity. It was in there at the ground level. It had set the root systems in place, but somehow lost touch with the working men's movements wider in the Labor Party and the trade unions. Good question, needs investigation. But I thought you'd like to know, at least for a start, like this great big beautiful gum tree here by the Macquarie River and these big powerful roots here, that so much of our Australian story has root systems like this that are driven deep into the Christian story, and that's something we need to remember. I'm Paul Roe, the Outback Historian.